Aloha! Welcome to the G'day Sally Show. I'm Sally Squires, entertaining the world. And tonight I'm reading a story from my book, Footsteps to Fairy Forest. And you know that whole book is about a little girl who finds a map in her grandmother's backyard. And when she opens up the map, there's all these footsteps to Fairy Forest. In fact, there's 26 footsteps all together. So each day she sets out with her compass and she finds another footstep, and as soon as she finds the stone which has the footsteps number on it, another fairy appears, and we're up to footstep 17. Willie Watcher had been missing from my windowsill for several days, and I was worried about him. I kept leaving fresh water in his water bowl, and I put out fresh breadcrumbs every day, but there was no sign of him. I asked my grandma if she had seen him anywhere, but she hadn't seen him either. So I set off early today, thinking about him as I walked. I kept my eyes open and checked all the trees for a sighting of him as I walked along the path. When I checked my map for directions, I was most surprised to see that I was to head north again. I thought that I would be going along the same path as I had to footstep 1, but to my surprise, as I started to head north, I could see that this was a different path to the one I had taken before. I began to wonder if this was some kind of fairy magic that had changed the path to north. Maybe they had set a spell last night and made everything different. The signpost for footstep 17 was what looked like a witch's hat. I was wondering if it would still be there, but so far I had found all the signs for the footsteps, so I was hoping that I would find this sign too. I forgot about Willie for a while as I tried to imagine which fairy I would meet today. Then I noticed a little bridge over a stream, and as I climbed up on the bridge I could see several fish swimming about in the water. There seemed to be families of fish with big ones and tiny ones. Maybe this is the time that baby fish and animals are born. I hadn't gone very far from the bridge when I met a furry raccoon. He was standing up on his hind legs as if he was walking towards me. I said hello, but he just stood there, and then he scampered up a tree. I was worried that he might be trying to eat the eggs from a bird's nest, but he was up so high I couldn't see him anymore. I thought I'd better keep walking and try to find the witch's hat signpost, so I left that raccoon up the tree. Suddenly I was surrounded by goats. They pushed up so close to me that I couldn't move. There were adult goats and several babies which kept making noises like they were hungry. I decided that the goats looked quite peaceful, so I pushed my way carefully through them and continued on my way. Then I saw a snowy white owl in a tree just near the path, and I wondered if it was the same owl who had kindly eaten the bees that had got caught in my hair when I was on my way to footstep 2. I think it was because he flew down in front of me and started to dance around with his head spinning. Then he lifted up off the path about 3 feet off the ground. It was then that I saw the tiny black witch's hat that I'd been looking for. I thanked my friend the owl, who had disappeared, and dug down with my spade to find the stone which said footstep 17. By now I knew I just had to wait for a minute and a second and the next fairy would appear. And sure enough, I soon saw a purple and green flash, and then the fairy landed on the edge of my bucket. She said she was Qalapterosta, and that she was the talkative fairy, and then I fell asleep. So now we're going to find out about the fairy called Qalapterosta, the talkative fairy. When Qalapterosta was a very tiny baby fairy, she was very, very shy. This tiny fairy was so shy that she hardly ever talked to anyone, not even to the queen of the fairies. Qalapterosta felt that all the other fairies had all the special fairy knowledge and that she had nothing to say. So that's why she said nothing. But she was very interested in everything around her and everything in fairy world. She would go off by herself whenever no one was looking, and she would explore. She learnt to talk to the flowers and plants, and later, when she was older, she learnt to talk to the trees and to listen to the leaves and understand what they were saying when the breezes blew. As a very tiny fairy, she would often be lifted up high by the stronger forest winds, and she would be flown all over the countryside on the fluffy winds. And while she was being flown about, she would look at everything she saw and make friends with all the creatures of nature, with all the strange trees and plants and flowers that did not grow in fairy forest. As she grew up, Qalapterosta started to notice that many of the babies in the forest, both fairy babies and baby birds and animals, had a very hard time getting to sleep at night. And each night their parents were exhausted. So Qalapterosta decided that she must try to help all those exhausted parents. One evening, as she was sitting by herself on a warm brown mushroom, just watching a line of ants carrying leaves back to their anthill, she could hear a baby bird crying up in its nest in the tree that was just above her. Worried about the baby bird, the fairy leapt off her mushroom resting place and flew up to the nest to see what was wrong. She landed right near the baby bird, and as she looked around, the fairy could see that the baby bird's parents were fast asleep in their nest. "What's wrong?" the shy fairy asked the baby bird. "I can't sleep," said the baby bird. "I need a bedtime story to rock me off to sleep." The fairy smiled. "No problem, little one," said Qalapterosta. "I'll tell you a bedtime story so you can go off to sleep happy." "Cheep, cheep," said the baby bird as its parents kept on sleeping. So Qalapterosta started to tell the baby bird all about the adventures she'd been having while she was growing up, all the places she had been and all the wonderful sights she had seen. And it was no time at all until the baby bird was fast asleep. When its parents woke up the next morning, their baby bird told them about the wonderful fairy who had told it bedtime stories until it fell asleep. And the baby bird's parents were so happy that they told their friends, the other birds in that tree, about the wonderful fairy who had soothed their baby bird by telling it bedtime stories until it fell asleep. Well, pretty soon everyone in Fairy Forest had heard about Qalapterosta and her great gift of telling bedtime stories. So all the other mother and father birds, who were too exhausted to tell bedtime stories to their baby birds so they could fall asleep, began to call on Qalapterosta to tell their baby birds bedtime stories. Then one evening, as Qalapterosta was telling bedtime stories to the baby birds as their parents slept, a mother squirrel noticed what was happening. Now this mother squirrel was so tired that she could hardly keep her eyes open when she was looking for acorns and nuts to bury. "Dear fairy," she said, "will you please tell bedtime stories to my baby squirrel at night so he can fall asleep?" "No problem," said Qalapterosta. "I'd be happy to." And then guess what happened? Yes, I know you've guessed. Our shy fairy, Qalapterosta, got busier and busier because all the other squirrels and all the other fairy forest animals wanted her to tell their babies bedtime stories. Now, Qalapterosta was puzzled. How am I going to tell each one of the baby birds and animals bedtime stories every night? There will not be enough time to go to every nest. So guess what she did? Qalapterosta decided that she would tell bedtime stories in the very middle of Fairy Forest every evening. And to make sure that all the baby birds and squirrels and other animals could hear her, she would make a magic spell with her magic wand so that she could be heard all through the forest. So she flew down into the very middle of the fairy ring in the very middle of Fairy Forest, and she sprinkled fairy dust all around her. And she took out her magic fairy wand, made up of letters and tiny golden pencils, and she cast her magic fairy spell. Unicorn Universe Unusual. Bedtime stories broadcast far across Fairy Forest. Babies sleep soundly swift. And that night, when she sat down in the very middle of the fairy ring in the very middle of Fairy Forest and started to tell her bedtime stories, all the baby birds and animals could hear her all across the forest. And they all fell asleep quite happily, listening to Qalapterosta, the talkative fairy. And do you know what else? Our sweet fairy, who once was very shy, was not shy anymore. So that was the story about the talkative fairy. You know, Hawaii is a microcosm of the world, with people here from all over the world. And Noa Hawaii is a microcosm of the traditional arts of the world, with beautiful patterns from many countries, They've been in business for more than 40 years with wonderful Hawaii-designed batik clothing. Their hand-dyed and handmade clothes have patterns that are based on traditional kapa and tapa designs from Hawaii, Polynesia, Micronesia, Indonesia, even New Zealand and Africa. So check out the wonderful items that Noa Noa has on their website, www.noanoahawaii.com.